everyone. My name is Sharika Sarasaja, and I'm a CSPC Program Committee member. We acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Conference is taking place on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. We are now about to participate in an interactive panel discussion on the results of the CSPC Parliamentarian Survey organized by CSPC. Also, please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and the CSPC 2022 hashtag. Finally, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for this session in the program app. Your feedback is important to us, and it'll help us put on a much better CSPC next year. Thank you, and enjoy the panel.
Okay. Oh, you can hear me. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to CSPC 2022 and the session of the presentation of the Survey of Parliamentarians organized by CSPC. We have a wonderful panel for about 1 hour prepared for you. On this panel, we present the results of the survey, and the panelists will discuss this, and then we have time for questions and answers. The presentation will be provided by Ricardo Pelli, who is the Research Associate at Climate Change, Canadian Climate Institute. He is a volunteer at Survey and Evaluation Report Committee of the CSPC, as well as Andrew Rottinger, who is the co-chair of the committee, and he works as a science advisor at Natural Resources Canada. We have wonderful panelists with us. Senator Dr. Zen Kutcher. Senator Kutcher serves in the Senate since 2018. And we are so grateful for Senator because we have been working on various files together, and it's so great to have a scientist on the Senate. And at the same time, we have MP Valerie Bradford from Waterloo, who will be with us and discussing this results. The MP Bradford is also a member of Research Science Committee of the House, and we are so grateful to have you with us. MP Bradford was elected in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. No, 21. I'm a newbie. That's right. Okay, so great. And last but certainly not the least, Kimberly Gerling, who is not a stranger to this crowd. She used to be the executive director of the Evidence for Democracy. And at the time when she was the executive director, they launched a survey of parliamentarians using the evidence in policymaking on the Hill. So she served as one of the advisors of this project, and we are grateful to have Kimberly with us today. Without any further ado, I would like to ask Ricardo, I guess, who present the first section of the results.
Thank you, Meredith, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Ricardo. I'm a volunteer with the CSPC, and I'm so excited to be presenting to you for the first time the results on behalf of the Evaluations and Report Committee from the CSPC. We're presenting for the first time the results on the survey of parliamentarians. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has impacted the lives of all Canadians for the past few years. And of course, it has brought into focus the importance of science and its relationship with policy. So today we're going to be presenting results on three main things: the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on parliamentary work, challenges in accessing and using scientific knowledge in light of the pandemic, and lessons learned on reducing barriers to accessing science. The objectives of this survey were to identify parliamentarians' challenges regarding access and use of science, to synthesize recommendations provided by parliamentarians on how to facilitate access to and use of science, to inform parliamentarians on how the use of science may have shifted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and to disseminate results to relevant stakeholders like we're doing today. The principles that guided the work of this survey include the intent to assist and to be helpful. We hope that the results of this survey can be used as a resource as we reflect on the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted balanced representation across political affiliations, demographics, and geography. We wanted to avoid bias. Consent was really important in this process. All questions of the survey were voluntary. And of course, it was important for us to protect the privacy and security of the survey respondents. Just a little bit about the methodology of this survey. This project started in July 2020. The committee started developing and designing the survey with the advice of a cross-partisan and expert group of advisors. It was an iterative process. Starting in June 2021, the survey started being disseminated via email, social media, and targeted calls. And the committee analyzed the results of this survey last summer. The survey was open for almost a year. A report will also be coming shortly in the future, and Andrew will tell you a bit more about it later. A little bit about the demographics of this respondents of this survey. So 26 parliamentarians participated in this survey, 18 of whom were senators and 8 were MPs affiliated with the House of Commons. We had a balanced gender representation, 50% identified as female and 50% of respondents identified as male. In terms of party affiliations, MPs that responded to this survey came from the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and the Bloc Québécois. And senators were mostly affiliated with the Independent Senators Group. In terms of geography, the survey respondents came from almost all regions of Canada, but most of them were based out of Ontario and Quebec, as shown on this map. Now we're going to delve into some of the results, and the first part is on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the work of parliamentarians. We asked parliamentarians to describe how the accessibility of reliable scientific knowledge has changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. 50% of respondents perceive that reliable scientific knowledge in their work is more accessible now than it was before the COVID-19 pandemic. Among the 15% who said that it is less accessible, they mentioned things like, for example, the impact that the pandemic had on meetings with peers or exchanging information in person. We asked parliamentarians if the exchange of scientific knowledge between Parliament and different groups has changed during the pandemic or as a result of the pandemic. And MPs and senators had slightly different answers. The majority of both MPs and senators felt that the exchange of scientific knowledge with peers or with other parliamentarians increased in light of the pandemic. MPs in particular felt that this increase exchanged the most with constituents and the private health sector, whereas senators felt that the exchange increased the most with other public servants and academia. We asked parliamentarians how the use of scientific knowledge changed in different aspects of their work, in different areas of their work. MPs and senators, again, had slightly different answers. But overall, 50% of both MPs and senators perceived that the use of scientific knowledge increased in all areas of their work post-pandemic. MPs use scientific knowledge the most with party meetings or caucus meetings, as well as with constituents, whereas senators felt that the use of scientific knowledge increased the most in policymaking work, as well as parliament sessions. Finally, we asked how the need for different types of scientific knowledge shifted in light of the pandemic. And MPs and senators had similar answers in this case. Social, health, and environmental sciences were the fields that were where scientific knowledge is the most needed according to the respondents of this survey. Natural sciences and engineering in this case were perceived as less needed compared to other fields, but respondents did say that other challenges like climate change or issues affecting Indigenous people, of course, rely on other fields that may be more relevant in this case. With that, I'm gonna pass it over to Andrew for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Ricardo. So for this next section, we'll be discussing the challenges in accessing and using scientific knowledge throughout the pandemic. So the first question that we asked parliamentarians is, during the COVID pandemic, how were the challenges for misinformation and disinformation, how was it more challenging for addressing this within their constituents? So we define misinformation as unintentionally misleading information. For example, this could be accidentally sharing false information through social media. We define disinformation as intentionally misleading information. And for example, this might be actors who fund targeted false information campaigns. Results are shown for all respondents in both cases here. And what we found was a unanimous agreement with all parliamentarians, an agreement that the COVID-19 made these challenges of misinformation, disinformation more difficult. Specific examples were social media and echo chambers, non-experts being considered experts, and challenges faced by people in discerning what is reliable information. Next, we asked the parliamentarians how often have they faced the following obstacles when trying to incorporate scientific knowledge in their parliamentary work during the pandemic. We provided 8 different options, which you can see on the left side of your screen here. The results are shown for MPs and senators here. Overall, we found that senators perceived less barriers than MPs when trying to incorporate scientific knowledge in their work. The MPs cited the difficulty of balancing constituent demands with the use of science as one of the challenges. In general, though, for both parties, we found that discerning what is reliable and unreliable data, lack of scientific consensus or variable scientific consensus, and the use of too much specialist scientific jargon and scientific findings were the key barriers overall. Next, we asked the parliamentarians how often they sought out new scientific information from each source in their parliamentary work related to the pandemic. For this, we provided 14 options, but to make sure that the slide wasn't too cluttered, we only provided the top 7 responses for MPs shown here and for senators shown here. In general, all respondents sourced their scientific knowledge from public health authorities, mainstream news organizations, and international scientific organizations such as the WHO. This is not uncommon, or this is not unlike how many of us in this room may have accessed science during the pandemic as well. There were some difference between MPs and senators, however, with MPs accessing scientific knowledge more often from constituents and personal contacts. This is shown as other here. Senators, however, didn't use this source as much. Instead, they accessed science from the Library of Parliament and from expert consultation. In terms of modes of communication that these offices use to communicate scientific knowledge to their constituents, we found that the predominant modes of communication were newsletters and emails or social media. However, overall, we found that MPs tended to use more diverse modes of communication with their constituents. And you can see here things like communication through events, local news, public health authorities, and official party communications, amongst other mechanisms, were used most often. This, of course, shows the difference in communication between these two parliamentary groups. Now, for the last section, we'll discuss some of the lessons learned on reducing barriers to accessing science. First, we asked the parliamentarians their agreement with the following statement. As a parliamentarian, I think that scientific knowledge needs to be translated into an accessible and policy-ready format for my work. And as you can see from the results, there was a near unanimous agreement with this statement. To dive in a little more about how we can make this science a little more policy-friendly, we provided 12 different mechanisms, and we asked which of the following mechanisms, if any, would help to provide timely, accessible, and understandable scientific knowledge to be used in your work. These mechanisms were based off of similar mechanisms for translating science into policy-ready formats in different governments around the world. I won't go through all these here, but I'll highlight the top 4 responses. So with nearly 3/4 of parliamentarians, they said that a nonpartisan science advisor for the House of Commons or the Senate would be a useful mechanism for translating science into a policy-ready format. This was followed by briefings on hot scientific topics, with nearly 70% of respondents saying this was a useful mechanism. And then rounding out the top 4, we have a committee of scientists and public servants for the House of Commons and Senate, and research summaries from experts in an accessible format. For the last question, we asked, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the inclination to use scientific knowledge in future parliamentary work related to other scientific fields? For example, this might be economic recovery, the environment, energy, agriculture, and similar fields. About 3/4 of parliamentarians say that they were more inclined to use science in these different fields, with the remainder saying there was no change, and notably, no parliamentarians felt less inclined after the pandemic. So that wraps up the survey, and now I want to take some time to kind of step back and look at the survey process on a whole. So first, I want to look at some of the limitations of the survey. So to begin, we want to acknowledge that we did have a limited sample size with only 26 parliamentarians participating. We note that this might not be representative of the opinions of the parliamentarians on a whole. We would also like to acknowledge that we did have some incomplete demographic representation. So for example, we didn't have all parties' affiliations represented, nor did we have all geographical regions. And again, this might have some effect in our results. And then finally, because our survey was a voluntary survey, there might be people that are more interested in using scientific information in their policymaking, may have been more likely to respond to the survey, and so we might be seeing a little bit of a pro-science bias in our results. In terms of key findings, overall, we found that the COVID-19 pandemic increased the demand for reliable scientific knowledge. However, we found that accessing clear, unbiased, and reliable scientific knowledge is a major challenge, and this major challenge is compounded by misinformation and disinformation, as was noted earlier in our results. We suggested different mechanisms for obtaining scientific knowledge, and parliamentarians noted that some particularly useful mechanisms could be a nonpartisan science advisor for the House of Commons and Senate, or briefings on hot scientific topics. And finally, I want to leave some quotes from parliamentarian participants who wanted to share these through this survey. So I won't read them all, but the point of them, the key message is similar. Clear, accessible, unbiased, and accurate scientific information is critical for our policymaking in the future related to the pandemic and other scientific related fields. So with that, I want to acknowledge some people. First, I'd like to thank our 12 advisors, one of whom is sitting on the panel here, Dr. Kimberly Gillerin. Without them, our survey design, our dissemination, everything would not have been as successful as it was. So very big thank you to them. I'd also like to thank our 26 parliamentarians who participated in our survey. Again, 2 of them who are sitting on our panel today, and the 9 who provided their names are shown up on the slide here. And then lastly, I'd like to thank the Evaluation Reports Committee, both from this year and years past. Again, without all your hard work week after week, I don't think this would have been possible. So for those that are here today, I guess stand up and just... And with that, thank you for listening to our presentation. The panel discussion will follow now. And finally, I just wanted to note, stay tuned for our final publication on this. We're working on a report, so make sure to check out CSPC social media and follow the website to stay tuned for that update. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So you notice that Andrew and Ricardo were sitting down. They are public servant, and that was the part that they were permitted and allowed to talk about this survey. So the rest will be discussions. So they will separate themselves from the remaining of the conversation. Without any further ado, I turn into Senator Kuchar. So your reflections from these results, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank Dr. Hariri and the Canadian Science Policy Centre for the kind invitation to be a member and to acknowledge the expertise of my fellow panel members. I'm looking forward to what you have to say. And thank you all for coming out and showing with your presence how important this topic is. You know, it's always been an important topic, but it's probably more important now than it has ever been. And I'm going to start my remarks by quoting from the annual report of the Chief Science Advisor of 2018, and I quote, "Healthy and prosperous societies depend on new knowledge, informed citizens, and good governance." By good governance, I mean not only the usual things you think about, but foundationally, the judicious application of best available evidence in policymaking. It's absolutely critical. Now, that best available evidence has to be available first and foremost in a very highly scientifically literate bureaucracy. Because if the bureaucracy, that's the people that make government run, they run Canada. We're just the face of the people. If the bureaucracy isn't highly scientifically literate, the information that comes up to ministers and parliamentarians and senators may not be of the quality or nature that you need it to be. So I just want to raise that issue. The second thing that I think is essential is the scientific literacy of political decision makers. That includes members of parliament and senators in our Westminster system of governance. So we need both. And very often, we think we only have to focus on one of those groups, but we need to focus on both of those groups. And I'm so pleased to see one of our panelists actually gone over the dark side and joining the bureaucracy and bringing her expertise. We need that. We need that. It's so important. So the reality of being a parliamentarian is that you are flooded, and I mean flooded, with information. Every day, there's just packages and packages of things to read. I sit on 3 different committees. The amount of work just to prep for one committee is exhausting, plus all the legislation, plus all the other things that you do. This is not a 9-to-5 job. And for members of parliament who have to then go back and do their constituency work, my hat's off to you. I don't know how you guys do it. It's incredible. We in the Senate don't have to do that. So the amount is just overwhelming, and it's constant, constant, constant. You feel like you're drinking from a fire hose all the time. And I am really aware that in my own level of area of professional expertise, I have some comfort that when I think about legislation or when I do the work of the committee, that I can contribute because I know the area that we're working in, though I must tell you, I am less and less comfortable the longer I have been away from my professional life. Because I'm just aware for how quickly things change and how fast knowledge moves. And I'm also very aware that as soon as I venture away from my lane, my level of personal ignorance of the topics at hand is huge. And I'm very concerned that knowing about something is not the same as knowing something. That's really important. And I don't kid myself just because I've read a couple of reports that I actually know the topic. But I think that's part of the self-awareness that all the scientists bring to their work. We're very aware of what we don't know. And using the best available scientific knowledge is only part of this complex cauldron of competing forces that we are engaged in every single day. Now you, who are members of the scientific community and the science policy and science communication communities, You think, oh, why don't you just use all this good stuff? Because there's so much other stuff that's coming in at the same time, which is competing for airspace, competing for your time, and also competing for where you're going to make your decisions. So best available scientific information is only one, but it is essential. And I think the pandemic has helped us understand how essential it is. There are just a couple of points that I want to make from this survey. And I want to acknowledge, and thank you for acknowledging the strengths and weaknesses of it. We appreciate that. But it is a place to start. Journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And it is helpful in that it has identified that we need to focus in these areas. And there are a couple of things I just want to highlight from my reading of it. About 1/2 of members of parliament and 1/3 of senators had self-reported that they had trouble discerning reliable data. Wow. We make the laws. We're having trouble discerning reliable data. That's a challenge, and that's a problem. How are we going to fix that? It's really important. We also say that most of us don't have a lot of scientific expertise. And I know in the Senate, and seeing some of the senators that responded, I know some of them have a lot of scientific expertise, and a lot of my colleagues don't. And why should they? I have no expertise in constitutional law. None. Zero. Why would I expect them to know deep science? So we have to use the expertise that we have in different areas, and we have to trade off and support each other. I also was struck by the differences where members of parliament get a lot of their information and where senators get their information. We get a lot of our information from the Library of Parliament, and I just want to give a shout out to the Library. They are superb. They do, if anyone hears from the Library of Parliament, you are awesome. You are awesome. You do this great, great work, and we can rely on you. And when I go to a committee and I've brought what the Library of Parliament says, and the witness says the opposite, we listen to the Library of Parliament because you do good, reliable work and it's independent. So thank you for that. And we also in the Senate tend to use expert consultation. Why? I think that's a bit askew in the survey because a lot of the people are scientists that answered the survey. And we're comfortable with that. We always go to our friends and ask them, I don't know the answer to that. What do you tell me? I don't know about different kinds of environmental science. I ask Rosa Galvez. She knows, right? That's how we work. All the scientists work like that. With that kind of approach to information, we have greater comfort that the information we're getting has a lower risk of bias, and we have greater comfort that it is more likely to be valid than not valid. And so I want to identify that with my colleagues from the House, that there are differences in how we get our information, which may, and I don't know it does, which may reflect itself in how we make decisions about legislation and other things. It's an interesting thought. And the last thing that I will say, and the survey pointed out beautifully, is that scientific knowledge has to be translated to the audience that it is for. It's got to be, I can sit there and read The Lancet, and I do, because I like to do that. Don't judge me, all right? But my colleagues are going to sit there and read The Lancet, and they need information in a clearly digestible format that they can take and use. And it has to be valid, it has to be reliable, and it has to be at the point in time that we need it. And I have to give a shout out to Science Up First, which Tim Caulfield and I catalyzed at the beginning of the pandemic, because they have helped us in the Senate with that. We've gone to them and said, look, we need information on vaccines. Can you put something together? And they did it for us. And then we distributed it to all our colleagues. So we have to have that kind of thing, but it can't be this one-off. So I'm really, really pleased that you have information about what we think we need. And I would really completely agree with what you've noted. I don't know if an independent science advisor is the way to go, but the UK has this POST model. And if you're not familiar with it, look it up, POST UK, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but leave a space between the U and T, okay? Or who knows what you'll get. And it's a fantastic model because it can respond very, very quickly with highest reliable information, and it is independent of Parliament. And that independence is so, so important, because the reality is, and I'm going to close on this, that we have so many places to go to for information. And I get 50 to 60 emails a day of someone who's gone on YouTube and is now wanting me to link to this credible person who's telling me that the WHO is going to take over the world. All the time. Okay, YouTube is not where we should be going for scientific information. And members of Parliament and senators need a reliable, just-in-time resource that can be put together to help us with that information when we need it, and that we can trust the information that we're getting. So thank you very much. That's my thoughts at the beginning.
Thank you so very much, Senator. That was great. I must say that after the blackout, actually, Senator arrived just at the time that we got the power, and he said, "Powerful people bring power." So
Actually, I said power to the people. And then he said, right on. So, you know,
thank you, Senator.
John Lennon
And
lives.
now to MP Bradford. By the way, she was using her cell phone or device not to respond to emails, etc. It was democracy in action. She was actually voting. I just want to transparently mention that people know. Please, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Senator Kuchar, for your comments. I agree with everything you said. So I'm an MP, so I'm one of these ones that he's talking about, that I have a constituency world as well as my work here on the Hill. And I want to thank CSPC for doing this very important survey. And I'm so honored to be part of this panel today and join you. I feel extremely unqualified to be here. Here's my disclaimer. I did not participate in the survey because I wasn't an MP at the time. I'm a newbie. I actually, probably only about a year ago now, started sitting in the House for the very first time, because the election was September 21st, and it was a while before they called us back. I know my onboarding pictures, oops, sorry, I have a poppy on them, so that's how I know it was this time. So in any case, I can't testify to how things were before COVID, because I kind of came on right in the throes of COVID. So I'll just tell you how things are working now. I am privileged to be on the inaugural Science and Research Committee, chaired by Kirsty Duncan, who I'm sure a lot of you know. She fought very hard for this committee. It's only been 150 years since we got, the Federation, and we finally got a parliamentary committee devoted to science and research. So that is very, very special. And so one of the things that I can see is on our committees, so originally, about a year ago, just about all the witnesses appeared virtually. So as we move along, more and more of them are now in the room with us. But we're still in the hybrid setting. And as you can see, democracy in action. I actually kind of escaped from question period today. And I'm glad to do that and be here, let me tell you. But there were 2 votes on. We're in a minority government. As the whip likes to remind us, votes can happen at any time. And there is no excuse, none, for ever missing a vote. So I was able to vote twice. I was so glad it wasn't actually during the time when I was supposed to be speaking. So I think one thing that we're all aware of, and I want to talk about science's critical role in helping us as the decision makers, the policy makers, in managing the unprecedented, the most overused word in the English language the last 3 years, the unprecedented global pandemic. Because the jurisdictions that managed this pandemic the most effectively relied the most heavily on the science. And the science changed. Let's be realistic, because this was a global pandemic like we never had before, and we really didn't realize what kind of beast or enemy we were dealing with. Do you remember people actually wiping down their groceries and their apples and everything with, Clorox cloths and everything, because we thought it was transmitted through touch and things like that? But then we realized it was airborne, it was a respiratory disease. So just think of how the decisions that were made by governments and jurisdictions and medical officers of health had to change, which again, I think really contributed to the skepticism in the public side because, well, what do you believe? You keep changing your advice. Well, that's because science kept updating the advice. So, I think science played such a critical role. And I really, really honed in on the slides there dealing with misinformation. That is, I feel, one of our greatest enemies. It's so divisive, like you can see south of the border. Your political beliefs are governed by the channel that you watch. Are you watching CNN or are watching Fox TV? Because you have a very different view of the world. So a lot of social media generates a lot of misinformation. So science is even more important than ever. But we just have to convince people that science doesn't lie. And these are very, very intelligent people. The senator's right. We come from very, very diverse backgrounds in the House of Commons. That's what makes it work. It's really important to have those diverse backgrounds. Many years ago, most of them there were lawyers. Nothing against lawyers, but it's a very finite part of society. Now we have people with a business background, people that have been involved maybe at different levels of government, people with a social service background. Yes, there's still some lawyers, but all these things, my background was in economic development, and I realize more and more every day how valuable that is. Certainly it makes me understand my riding very well and its strengths and opportunities. And, so I really appreciate that. So the Library of Parliament, I couldn't agree more. They provide us with very, very good background information for the witnesses that we're going to hear at Science and Research. They give us some intelligent questions that are suggested that we ask these witnesses, because sometimes you don't even feel qualified to ask a question of these people in their area of expertise that is way beyond your knowledge, because we're just regular people representing other regular, normal people, but we need to find out the information on their behalf. So the Library of Parliament is objective, it's very quick. I long for the day when we can actually go into that gorgeous Library of Parliament, but I'll be retired long before then, but very special place. I just consider myself privileged that I actually did see it live. So they had to really transition for how they were providing the information to support the parliamentarians. Because let's remember that we are the decision makers, we are the policy makers. So we rely on good, accurate, understandable information. It's so critical that the information be dumbed down for regular folks like us so that we can understand what they're talking about. And again, I would just say the hybrid parliament, not everything about COVID has been dreadful. Most of it has, but it's really accelerated the pace of change and forced us to make changes that we should have already been doing probably. We want Parliament to be family friendly. Canada is a very, very big country, and we want Parliament to reflect the diversity, families, people of all ages. I can't imagine being a parliamentarian with the hours that we keep with a young family. But at least with hybrid voting and these sort of things, you could be home with the kids and still vote at night if the votes are coming up. Like last night, I was at a gala, and there was a couple of votes, and it was quite hilarious because all we MPs from all sides of the House are lurking outside the kitchen entrance because the light was good so that we all do the facial recognition and get our votes in. It was pretty interesting. But this would have never happened. So we're fighting to keep it because we think, the other thing too is, think how unenvironmentally friendly it is for us, because Canada is very large. Like for me, coming from Kitchener, whether I fly or I drive, it's 5.5 hours. So, but we have people that come from BC and the Yukon, it's even longer for them. So every week, like my commute to work is to Ottawa. And even during the Freedom Convoy and everything, which was a little bit intimidating, I was a new MP and I felt it was very important that I be here every day to connect with my new caucus members and get to know them better. And this is where the job is that I was elected to do. But it's not that green when you think of everybody flying in and then flying back. You fly in on Sunday, you fly back on Thursday night or Friday. And so if you can do some of it hybrid and spend more time in your riding with your constituents, also equally important work, it's great to have that option. So I'm probably completely off topic, but given that I wasn't really here at the time this survey was conducted, I don't know what it was like before, so it's hard for me to say what the change is. But I can tell you that, you know, it is really, really important to have good scientific information readily available to the politicians and the senators so that we can make intelligent, well-informed decisions. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to participate on this panel today.
Thank you very much. So, last but certainly not the least, Dr. Kimberly Gerling. I must say that Kimberly was a MITAC's Science Policy Fellow and then moved to different positions. Now, actually, she works as the manager of the Science Policy team at the Office of Canada's Chief Public Health Officer. Kimberly, over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. And just a huge thank you to both of you for your lovely remarks. It was really quite interesting to hear you both reflect, and after hearing the results of the study, and then to be able to speak to the work that we've done. So I'll preface by saying, you know, while I am in the government now, I'm speaking today really on behalf of my previous role and the study that I did. So yeah, I think Mehrdad had mentioned earlier, in my past life, before moving back into the government, I was working for an organization called Evidence for Democracy. A little shout out to the E4D team who's sitting over there now. You can come and chat with them later. But at the time, so E4D, for those of you who don't know, is an organization that works to connect evidence with decision makers and really advocate for the transparent use of science in government decision making, working with scientists, working with the public, working with governments to really facilitate that bridge between research and practice. And at the time, when I was the executive director at E4D, I conducted a study with the team where we did sort of a similar approach, where we really wanted to better understand the processes by which evidence is integrated into decision-making in the House of Commons. And so we conducted not a survey, but interviews, which I found was actually a really interesting way of taking a look at this question. We talked to also a fairly small sample. We talked to 17 MPs who were from multiple parties, represented all across Canada, multiple genders, also multiple scientific backgrounds or non-scientific backgrounds, working on a huge variety of different committees. And we really kind of got into the question of how they find evidence, what they consider to be good research, what were some of the challenges and some of the barriers, and potential solutions to really bridging the gap between evidence and the work that they did. So what I think I'll do today is I'll reflect on some of the findings from our study, because I think it's quite interesting to see how things have really changed from the perspective of parliamentarians. And then I'll reflect on some of the results and recommendations that came out of the study, and then some of the work that we did following up to try and address those challenges. So not surprisingly, what we found in our study as well was that every MP we talked to said that they valued good, credible information in the work that they did, and that access to robust scientific evidence was hugely important, but the sources of the information that MPs were getting their information from was hugely varying. So everything from their constituents to peers to external organizations and nonprofits or private sector. Google, came up quite a lot as well. I do want to say that the biggest input was the Library of Parliament. Almost every single MP we talked to said that the Library of Parliament was their most valuable resource. I always joke that the major finding from our study was that the library is awesome. So I totally agree. So it was really interesting to see that, where MPs get their information from, including what they considered to be scientific information, really varied a lot and came from a huge amount of sources. But what MPs considered to be credible information really varied. So everyone we talked to had a lot of different processes for checking their credible information. So like the senator had spoken to, sometimes they said, well, I have a really good colleague in the House that I trust because they're a scientist, or I have a friend who works at the Research Council that I sort of check my information against. But it wasn't always clear how to check for information, or like where to go to really validate good sources of information. And there was also a real preference for information that was clear of political bias, clear of partisan bias, but when information is coming at you from all sources, it's not always easy to know what has political spin or what doesn't have political spin, especially when it's coming fast. Another thing that we found that was really interesting was that what was considered to be like scientific evidence or research wasn't always clear. So there wasn't a unified view of how to define scientific information versus robust evidence versus scientific advice. So we kind of we dug into this a little bit in the interviews, and we kind of decided that, well, if it's collected in a robust or systematic way from a reputable source, that would be something that we consider really valuable. But again, it wasn't always clear how to check that or how to do that in a really robust way, especially when it's happening really fast and especially when there's a ton of information. And so we've kind of dug into what those challenges were with the members that we talked to. And again, I think that we heard very, very similar challenges to what you both raised and what you heard in the study as well. The first big one was really just time. MPs are faced with this massive amount of information. Like you said, Dr. Kuchar, it's like drinking from a fire hose, and they're just getting information thrown at them from all sources all the time, constantly. And so it can be really challenging to have to digest that information and process and actually do that credibility check at the same time as you're voting sometimes when you're sitting on a panel. A lot of the MPs we talked to described that same situation of saying, okay, well, I have to go and vote on shark finning, and I don't know anything about shark finning, so I'm in a taxi and I'm trying to check my information. So that time factor and that information overload factor was a big one. Same with that misinformation factor. And I found it quite concerning in this study to see that all MPs are seeing that as an increasing challenge, which I would say most of us who work in the field of information management would say that that's probably true. And that's a real issue. So I think that that's something that would be really interesting to kind of get into as well. Another challenge that we heard in the study was that, the reality of doing political decision making is that no decision can ever be fully evidence-based if just relying on pure scientific information. Because the reality of being a good representative of your constituents is that you have to be thinking about multiple factors, economic inputs, social factors, really gaining and keeping the vote of your people and the interests of the people you talk to. So I remember having a conversation with an MP from Nova Scotia who said, sometimes it can be really challenging to make decisions about things like the fishing industry when my constituents are, people who are really, really deep in this industry when the science might be saying to change something. And so how do you make evidence-informed decisions that represent your people if there's those conflicts? And then the last thing that we found was that there really was a lack of resources in some of these MP offices for doing that kind of robust digging. So while the library was a good tool, some of these MPs we talked to had multiple staff, and some of them just had their one little staffer that they worked with every single day. And so it's not always easy. So you can see that there's a lot of links to the findings that were presented today, which I think is really interesting. And I wanted to just kind of walk through some of the recommendations that came out of that study, some of which E4D actually started working on. So the first was that we found that there was really a need to just facilitate that linkage between researchers and MPs. One of the ways that we got into in the study was really through committees. And I think it's a really interesting point that both of you raised that. A lot of the MPs said that, well, we access scientists through the committees, witnesses coming in, but having worked as a scientist, not a lot of scientists know about committee processes or know how to input into committee processes or know where to find, the discussion points that are happening at those committees. So I think that there's some space for facilitating support for scientists to serve as witnesses or to just gain, civic knowledge about how parliamentary proceedings actually happen. Another was to improve direct access for parliamentarians to researchers and to the research that they do. One of the questions that came up a lot in our conversations was MPs had asked, is there a database or something that I can search to find researchers that are working on X or Y? And the reality was that there weren't clear ways of doing that. There are some tools, but it's not always clear. But if there were options to be able to sort of identify people in Canada who are doing research on a particular topic, people around the world who are doing research on a particular topic, and I think COVID did sort of open up some doors with tools like Can COVID and these big networks of scientists who are sharing information really rapidly. But I do think there's some space for just facilitating that bridge. Also just enabling the scientific community to speak the language of government. You know, it came up in the study, it came up in both of your remarks today, that the need for policy relevant research is so obvious, but there aren't a lot of obvious forums for scientists to be putting their science out there in policy space. And I think CSPC and other sort of policy relevant forums like this are really amazing for that. And EVRD does a lot of this work as well in enabling scientists to learn how to speak to government, learn how to write policy briefs, learn how to write effective emails and correspondences to your members and facilitate those relationships. And then I think maybe I'll leave it at so my last 2 points are, the last is that I think that we can also do better in sort of parliamentary spaces or government spaces and actually asking the questions to our research community. I remember one of the MPs we talked to said, oh, I just wish that I had more information about the impact of things like Netflix and digital TV networks on the impact of like cultural language learning. And I was like, oh, that's like an amazing master's project. Someone would love to do that. But you know, if we're not actually asking the questions to our research community, we might not get those answers. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. I think that there's a lot of spaces for us to have some conversation. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm really thankful to have a chance to come back and speak about this stuff. Obviously, it's something I love.
We will see about that. Thank you so very much. My mic is on? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much to all our panelists. Let me just mention a couple of points. First, the panel was supposed to have multi-partisan representations. Shout out to those MPs from Conservative, NDP, and Bloc Québécois. They really want to be here. But the panel, unfortunately, the timing was slightly overlapped with the question period and some committee works, but they were really keen to be here to discuss the results. So we even had some last minute cancellation and they were so unhappy about this. This is the fresh of the oven results. We will have this more analyzed and published, and we'll have more discussion about this, discussions and different panels and sessions in Ottawa, across the country, and also in virtual sessions, hopefully at the Hill, about these results. So we want to get you engaged and have more panelists and different views to discuss this. That's number one. Number two, if Andrew or Ricardo could please put the slide of the members of the advisory committee and oh, it's there, okay. So I just want to once again thank all the volunteers of the CSPC Evaluation and Report Committee. That was an entirely volunteer-based work, and they did a great job in getting the responses from the parliamentarians, analyze them, and finalize them in this format. And also I want to thank all those people who served as advisors of this committee. We have in fact 3 former members of parliament who helped us also to finalize the questions. And they also want to be, 2 of them at least want to be here, but they couldn't make the travel and to here. But unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. This panel was arranged for 1 hour, and our panelists had a lot to say, but I want to thank them for this. Definitely, we will come back to you with more on the survey of parliamentarians. Thank you so very much. The next panel will be a conversation with Minister Champagne in half an hour. Enjoy the break. Thank you.